In the heart of the bustling city, amidst the constant rush of pedestrians and the honking of distant cars, a homeless woman knelt on the cold concrete sidewalk. Her clothes were tattered, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, desperate hope. Beside her, two small girls huddled together, their little faces turned up to the strangers walking by. Each step they took a reminder that they didn't belong in the world that moved so fast around them. The woman didn't mind the dirty stares or the uncomfortable silence. Today, she had no pride left, only a plea, one she could no longer keep to herself. When she saw him, tall, sharp-dressed, walking briskly past the corner, her heart skipped a beat. He was everything she wasn't: successful, wealthy, important. But in that moment, she didn't see a man of fortune, she saw a lifeline. She called out, her voice trembling. "Please," she whispered, barely above the noise of the crowd, "please, can you help? Can you adopt my daughters?" The millionaire didn't stop at first. People like him didn't stop for people like her. The crowd surged past, oblivious. But something stopped him, a tug in his chest. The mother's voice was filled with so much fear, yet an unyielding sense of purpose. He slowed, glancing back, confused by what he had heard. Adopt her daughters? The words echoed in his mind. He had known the occasional request for spare change, maybe a meal. But this was something else entirely. He stood there, just a few feet away, uncertain how to respond. How could anyone ask for something so impossible? The woman's gaze held steady, eyes locked with his as if she already knew the answer, if only he would listen. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to slow. The woman's daughters, so small and fragile, clung to her side, not understanding what was happening but sensing that something monumental was unfolding. She repeated her plea, softer this time, but more desperate. "Please, they need someone. I've lost everything. I'm just asking for a chance, for them." The millionaire's heart sank. He couldn't look away. The woman wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for something far more profound, something that, in that moment, seemed beyond anything he could ever offer. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something much bigger than himself. The crowd moved around him, indifferent, but in his chest, the weight of that plea pressed harder. He was about to walk away, as he had so many times before. But there was something about the woman, something about the fear in her eyes, that made him hesitate. The millionaire stood frozen, his feet rooted to the ground as he stared at the woman and her two daughters. He had heard her clearly, but the request seemed too absurd to process. Adopt her children? It didn't make sense. He had everything: money, power, the kind of life most people dreamed of, and yet, here was this woman, offering him a chance to take on something far beyond any business deal or charity check he'd ever signed. He glanced over at her, his eyes meeting hers, and in that brief moment, something about the sincerity in her gaze struck him. She wasn't asking for money or food, those were requests he had grown accustomed to, the usual pleas that filled the streets of this city. But this was different. She was asking for something far more intimate, far more profound. It was as if, in that instant, she was baring her soul to him. The woman repeated herself, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please. I'm not asking for charity. I just want them to have a chance. A future. A chance I can't give them." The millionaire's mind raced. What did she mean by this? Was it some kind of trick? Maybe she had heard about his wealth and thought she could make a fool of him. But no, something in her tone made it clear that she wasn't lying. There was no deceit in her eyes, only the raw, painful truth of a mother who had been brought to the edge of despair. He took a step closer, and she immediately reached out, her hands trembling as she adjusted her daughter's blankets around them. The children clung to her, sensing the weight of the situation, but they didn't speak. They only watched, their innocent eyes wide with confusion. The millionaire's gaze flickered to the girls, who were no older than 7 or 8. They were thin, their clothes dirty, their faces marked with the weariness of living on the streets. How long had they been in this situation? How many nights had they gone without a proper meal or a warm bed? It hit him like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He wasn't used to being in situations like this. In his world, problems were solved with money, with solutions that could be bought and sold. But this wasn't something he could just fix with a check. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't business. It was personal. Why me? The question slipped out before he could stop it. He immediately regretted it. What did it matter why she had chosen him? But it was a question that gnawed at him, the curiosity and disbelief making him speak without thinking. The woman hesitated, looking down for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then she met his eyes again. "You don't know me, I know," she said softly. "But I see the way people like you walk past. You have everything, and I have nothing. But I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a chance for my children. They deserve better than this. They deserve a life where they don't have to fight for every meal, where they don't have to wake up every day wondering if it will be their last." The millionaire shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just the way she spoke, it was the way she looked at him. Her words weren't full of bitterness or anger. They were full of resignation, of a mother who had run out of options and had nothing left to give but the one thing she could still offer, her children's future. He took a deep breath. He had seen suffering before, of course. His wealth had afforded him the ability to ignore it most of the time, to stay within his carefully curated bubble. He could donate to causes, attend galas, stroke his ego with the thought that he was helping. But this was something else. This wasn't an event where he could write a check and forget about it. This was real. These were real lives, real people, and in a way, he was being asked to step into that reality. "Adoption," he repeated, as if saying the word again might make it sound more reasonable. It didn't. She nodded, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "If you don't want to, that's fine. I understand. I've asked for too much already. But please, if there's any way, anything at all, could you at least help them?" He looked at the girls again, still clinging to their mother, their eyes full of innocence yet shadowed by a life they had never asked for. He had everything they would never know. He had the world at his fingertips, yet standing here, in this moment, he felt completely helpless. His mind spun in circles. The idea of adopting 2 children, of becoming responsible for their lives, their futures, was far beyond anything he had ever considered. The logistics alone were overwhelming. But then there was that voice in his head, the one that cut through all the doubts. What if this is your chance to make a real difference? He stared at the woman, then at the children, and for the first time in his life, he felt something stir within him. A sense of responsibility, of compassion that went beyond what he could buy. This wasn't a transaction. It was a test. A test of character. He exhaled slowly. I don't know what I can do," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll do something. I'll try." What he had ever imagined. He was a businessman, a man of logic and control. He made decisions based on numbers, on trends, on what was most profitable. But this wasn't about profits. It was about people, about lives, about 2 young girls who needed a home, and a mother who was willing to sacrifice everything for their future. He swallowed again, feeling a weight on his chest that he couldn't shake. I don't even know where to start," he murmured, as much to himself as to her. The woman's eyes softened, understanding his hesitation. "I don't know either," she admitted quietly. I just thought maybe someone like you could give them a chance. A real chance. The millionaire stood there, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, of doubts, and, surprisingly, guilt. He had everything, and yet, for all the wealth in the world, he felt helpless in this moment. He could send money, sure. He could arrange for a house, for their immediate needs to be met. But to adopt them? To make them a part of his life, his world? He couldn't even begin to fathom how such a shift would look. But he couldn't walk away either. No matter how difficult it seemed, no matter how out of place it felt, he couldn't ignore the raw, desperate plea in the woman's eyes. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice a little firmer this time. It was the question that kept echoing in his head. Why had she chosen him? What made her think that he could be the one to take them in? The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of the years. "Because you're the first person to stop," she said simply. "I've asked others before, but they just walk by. You looked at us. And I don't know, maybe I just hoped that someone like you, who has everything, might see that my girls deserve something better than this life on the streets." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For all his wealth, his success, he had never had to fight for survival the way this family had. He had never known hunger, fear, or the crushing weight of not knowing where you would sleep that night. In an instant, the walls he had built up around himself, his busy schedule, his professional facade, the armor of wealth, began to crumble. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't just walk away from this. He took a deep breath, letting the air settle in his lungs, and turned his gaze back to the woman. The words formed in his mind, but they came out slowly, almost unsure. I don't know if I can adopt them. I don't even know what that entails. But I can't just leave them like this." There, in that moment, was the shift. Not a grand declaration, not some heroic gesture, but something more subtle. Something that made the millionaire realize that no matter how out of his element he felt, this was a chance to do something that mattered. The woman's eyes filled with something, hope? Relief? It was hard to say, but she finally let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You'll help them?" I'll find a way," he said, his voice steadying. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way." For a brief second, the world around them seemed to pause. The noise of the city faded as the mother's face broke into a small, disbelieving smile. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you for hearing me." As the words hung in the air, the millionaire felt a new kind of weight settle into his chest, not one of dread, but of responsibility. He wasn't just making a donation. He wasn't just helping a mother with her children. He was opening a door to a future that, just moments ago, had seemed impossible. He didn't know what the future held, or how this decision would change his life, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he had seen their faces, heard their stories, and understood the quiet desperation that had brought them to him. The air between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts, as the millionaire took a step back, trying to process the gravity of the situation. But the woman's eyes, those tired, haunted eyes, kept pulling him back. The girls clung to her side, the older one barely lifting her head from her mother's lap, while the younger girl played absently with a frayed piece of cloth. The millionaire's heart ached as he stood there, unsure of what to say or do next. The question of why this woman was asking him, a man who had everything, still lingered in the back of his mind. But it was quickly overshadowed by something far more powerful, the realization that he didn't know her story. He didn't know what had brought her to this corner of the city, begging for help. "I don't mean to pry," he began softly, his voice low as he tried to bridge the silence between them, "but how did it come to this?" The woman's eyes flickered with hesitation, her lips trembling slightly as she looked down at her children. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, with a quiet sigh, she began. "It wasn't always like this. I used to have a good life. A job, a home, everything. I thought I was doing okay, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But life doesn't always give you what you expect. Sometimes, you don't even see it coming. She looked up, meeting the millionaire's gaze, and for the first time, the rawness of her pain was laid bare. I had a husband. He was a good man. We had our struggles, like anyone. But we were getting by. And then, he was gone. She paused, swallowing hard. The words seemed to catch in her throat, as if even now, all these years later, the wound hadn't fully healed. There was an accident. A car crash. It was sudden. Too sudden. One moment, he was there, and the next, I was, alone. She closed her eyes briefly, the memory clearly too painful to relive. After that, everything fell apart. I couldn't pay the bills. I lost the house. The bank took everything. Her hands clenched into fists as she looked down at the ground, fighting the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. I tried. I really did. I worked as much as I could, cleaning, waiting tables, anything I could find. But nothing was enough. And then, when the girls were old enough to understand, I had to tell them. We were homeless. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't change that for them. The millionaire felt his chest tighten. He had been listening to her words, but now, hearing the depth of her loss, his perspective shifted. It wasn't just about her being a woman asking for help, it was about her fighting for her children, for their future. And every battle she'd lost made it that much harder to keep going. I couldn't keep us off the streets, she continued, her voice shaking. I didn't want them to grow up like this. But no matter how hard I fought, it wasn't enough. Every time I thought we were getting somewhere, something else happened, another setback, another struggle. I've spent every day trying to make sure they have what they need, even when I don't. Her gaze softened as she looked at her daughters. But they deserve more than this. They deserve a chance to feel safe. To be happy. To have a real life, not just a fight for survival every single day. The millionaire stood still, absorbing her words, the weight of her story settling over him. It wasn't just poverty that had driven this woman to ask for help, it was the unrelenting grief of loss, the crushing weight of trying to be everything for her children when the world had taken everything from her. And now, standing before him, she had nothing left but the hope that maybe, just maybe, a stranger might see her struggle and offer her a way out. He glanced down at the girls again, who seemed to be listening intently, but said nothing. The younger one had stopped playing with her cloth and was now looking at him with wide, hopeful eyes. The older girl, though she appeared calm on the surface, kept glancing at her mother with the kind of silent understanding that only a child who had lived through trauma could possess. For the first time, the millionaire realized that these weren't just children who needed a place to live. These were children who needed a home, a place where they could feel loved and safe, where their future wasn't shaped by the harsh realities of the world around them. The woman wiped a tear from her cheek, though she quickly brushed it away, trying to maintain her composure. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have burdened you with all of this. The millionaire shook his head quickly, his mind whirling as he considered what she had just shared. No, it's not a burden. I need to understand, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You don't need to apologize. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the city's noise now a distant hum as they shared this weight. The woman's story had changed something within him. He wasn't just looking at a homeless family anymore. He was looking at a mother's fight to protect her children. He was looking at a woman who had lost everything, and was now asking for the one thing she couldn't give them, a future. The millionaire exhaled slowly, the air thick with the implications of what he was beginning to understand. This was no longer about charity. It was about doing something that mattered. Something that would change their lives forever. I didn't mean to burden you with all this, she said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "I know I'm just a stranger to you. But when I saw you, I just thought maybe you could give them a chance. A real chance." The millionaire stood there, his mind racing with everything she had shared. He could still see the image of her in his mind, the woman with nothing left but the love for her daughters, who had been through so much and yet kept fighting every day for their future. Her strength was undeniable, but it was also clear that her strength was running out. The story she had just shared was one of loss, but also of survival, of a mother who would stop at nothing to make sure her children had something better. Her sacrifice echoed in his mind, not as a plea for charity, but as a desperate cry for hope. And he couldn't ignore it. He took a step closer, feeling his heart beat faster, as if the decision he was making had weight he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't promise her the world, he knew that. He didn't even know how he could help, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not after hearing her story. Not after seeing the raw determination in her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but I don't want to just walk away either. I'll do what I can. I'll figure out how we can make this work. You deserve that. Your girls deserve that." The woman blinked, as if unsure she had heard him correctly. Her breath caught, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the entire world had paused for just a beat, waiting for something to happen. Then, slowly, she stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for his. The girls stood with her, watching cautiously. The older one stepped forward just slightly, as if understanding that something important was taking place. The younger one stayed close to her mother, holding tightly to the hem of her tattered coat. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. You really don't know what this means. It's not just about a home. It's about their future. You're giving them a chance to live without fear, to feel like they matter." He nodded, his throat tight. He didn't have the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was stepping into something bigger than himself. He had spent so much of his life focused on his business, his wealth, his status, but now, standing here with this woman and her daughters, he realized that none of that mattered in the face of what was truly important: connection, compassion, the chance to make a difference in the lives of others. "You won't regret this," the woman added, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. The millionaire looked at her, his expression softened by a mixture of confusion, compassion, and a growing resolve. "I'm not sure what this means yet. But I'm not walking away. I'll help you. I'll help them." And in that moment, as the woman's tears of relief mixed with the sunlight that filtered down through the city's skyline, he knew that his life had just changed forever. He had taken the first step, not into a world of wealth or business deals, but into a world of human connection, where the only thing that truly mattered was the difference one person could make in the life of another. The millionaire sat in his office the next morning, staring at the papers in front of him. His mind was racing, but his hands were still. The office was pristine, just as it always had been, a reflection of his perfectly controlled life. But now, it felt suffocating. Everything about his world seemed out of place. The high-rise buildings, the piles of paperwork, the meetings and phone calls, it all seemed so irrelevant. He had promised to help the woman. He had made a decision, one that had begun to feel like more than just a charitable gesture. But the more he thought about it, the more overwhelming it became. Adoption wasn't as simple as writing a check or making a phone call. It was a lifelong commitment, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But there was no going back now. He couldn't just leave them to fend for themselves again, no matter how unprepared he felt. As the day wore on, he found himself pacing back and forth in his office, struggling to focus. His assistant had already called twice to remind him of the afternoon meeting with a potential investor. But he couldn't concentrate on anything but the faces of those two girls, the way the older one had stared at him with hope, and the younger one's quiet trust. He needed to do something. He needed answers. Finally, he made the call. "I need to know what the process is for adopting," he said when the social worker answered the phone. "I know it's a complicated process, but I need to understand what I'm getting into." The social worker on the other end of the line was patient, explaining the intricacies of the legal and emotional challenges involved. "It's not a decision to be taken lightly," she said. "There's a lot of paperwork, home visits, and background checks. You'll also need to consider the emotional impact this will have on everyone involved. It's not just about providing shelter, it's about creating a family. And that takes time." The millionaire had expected something along those lines, but hearing it so bluntly felt like a punch to the gut. The weight of it all pressed on him harder than he expected. I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be that kind of father figure. I have no experience with children, let alone adopting them." "You may not feel ready," the social worker said gently, "but sometimes, the most important thing is the willingness to try. The children have been through trauma, and what they need most is stability and love. If you're willing to provide that, it's a step in the right direction." He fell silent, taking in her words. Stability. Love. He could provide that, couldn't he? He had the resources, the capacity to give them a home. But there was more to it than just a roof over their heads. There was an emotional depth he hadn't prepared for, a kind of fatherhood that wasn't about money, but about time, patience, and sacrifice. He looked out the window at the city below, the noise of traffic a distant hum. He had everything, money, power, influence, but he had never felt more uncertain of his abilities. Later that evening, he found himself driving through the streets of the city, the car's headlights cutting through the dark. He had been to this neighborhood before, of course, he passed through it regularly on his way to meetings, but tonight, it felt different. It felt personal. As he pulled up in front of the small apartment complex where the woman lived, he hesitated. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as his heart thudded against his chest. What if this was a mistake? What if he wasn't what they needed? But then he saw her. The woman was standing outside the building, her daughters by her side. She looked up as his car approached, her face lighting up with cautious hope. He stepped out of the car, trying to steady his breath, and walked toward her. She smiled, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She knew this decision wasn't going to be easy. "Hi," she said softly, her voice a little shakier than before. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." The millionaire gave a small, uncertain smile. "I told you I'd help. I'm here." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to put so much on you. But I can't thank you enough." For a moment, they stood there, silently. The girls were quiet too, watching with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The younger one reached up, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Can we go inside?" the millionaire asked. "I've been thinking about what we talked about, and I think I want to take the next step." She blinked, startled by his words. "You do?" "I do," he said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty swirling inside. "I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I'm willing to try. I'll figure it out." Her face softened with disbelief, and for a moment, he could see the weight lifting off her shoulders. But as the moment stretched, he realized that there was still so much more to be done. He had committed, but the journey had only just begun. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles he hadn't even anticipated. But in that moment, as he looked at her daughters, so small, yet so full of potential, he knew he had made the right choice. He had taken the first step. And now, there was no turning back. "I want to talk more about what comes next. If that's okay with you." The woman nodded, still hesitant but clearly grateful. As they walked up the steps to the small apartment, the weight of the moment settled on the millionaire's shoulders. This was real. This wasn't some business deal or financial transaction. This was a human connection, raw and unpolished, and it was a lot more complicated than he had anticipated. The apartment was cramped and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the polished luxury he was used to. It smelled of old furniture and a faint, lingering trace of something like burnt food. The walls were covered with drawings and photos, children's artwork that had been taped haphazardly to the peeling paint. The millionaire had never been in a place like this before, not outside of his charitable events, at least. It felt real. He noticed the girls immediately. The older one, who had spoken so little before, now seemed more curious, watching him with intense eyes that seemed to weigh him up, evaluating whether he could really follow through on his promises. The younger one, on the other hand, was quiet, sitting at the table and quietly fiddling with a doll, her small hands moving in slow, deliberate motions as though to avoid disturbing the fragile peace in the room. The woman led him to a small couch, and they all sat down, the space tight. She glanced at her daughters, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but it quickly faded. "I never imagined this is where I'd be, asking for help," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But after everything, sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, I just can't get back up." The millionaire could feel his chest tighten as he listened to her speak. He had seen many people struggle in his life, but this was different. There was no corporate layer of pretenses, no professional facade. This was a woman who had been through unimaginable hardship and was still fighting every day to give her children a life. He didn't know if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't walk away. "I understand," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. "I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I want to help. I want to give them a real chance. If you're willing to try, I'm willing to be here. But I think we need to take it one step at a time." The woman's eyes searched his face, as though trying to determine if he was sincere. She had seen so many people make empty promises before, too many offers that never came to anything. And yet, something in his voice, the way he said those words, made her want to believe. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes once more. "I don't know how to thank you. For the first time in so long, I feel like there's hope. Hope for them. Hope for me." The millionaire sat quietly, watching her closely. She had spent so much time trying to be strong for her daughters, carrying the burden of their survival on her shoulders, and now, for the first time, she was allowing herself to feel something else, hope. And that was something he wasn't sure he was ready to handle, but he knew it was a responsibility he could not shirk. That night, as he lay awake in his own bed, the weight of the decision weighed on him heavier than ever. His mind raced with questions. What kind of father figure could he really be to these girls? Could he offer them stability and safety in a world that had shown them nothing but hardship? He thought about his life, about the years he had spent focused on business and wealth, always striving for the next deal, the next success. But now, those things seemed empty, like distant goals that meant nothing in the face of what this family needed. They weren't looking for a mansion or expensive gifts. They just wanted the chance to feel safe, to feel loved. And he wanted to give that to them. But the path ahead wasn't clear, and the stakes were higher than he had ever known. Tomorrow, he would start the next step. He would find the best way to help them, whether it meant adopting them or finding another solution. He would figure it out. But one thing was certain, his life was no longer just about business. It was about something bigger. Something that made the world of profit and loss seem insignificant. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. The millionaire had set everything in motion, doing what he could to navigate the complex adoption process. But with each step, the challenges grew. It wasn't as simple as writing a check or offering temporary shelter. There were investigations, interviews, and a whole system that moved too slowly for his liking. One afternoon, he sat at his desk, staring at the latest report from the Social Services Agency. His stomach churned as he read through the lines, further investigation required. Concern about stability and long-term suitability. The words hit him like a slap. Stability? Long-term suitability? He had thought that his wealth and resources would be enough to prove his commitment. But now, it felt like the system was throwing obstacles in his path, questioning whether he was truly fit to take on the responsibility of these two girls. His wealth didn't matter in the eyes of the law. What mattered was his ability to provide emotional support, guidance, and a safe environment. Frustration welled up inside him, but he pushed it down. He had promised the woman. He had promised the girls. And he wasn't about to back out now. The following evening, he drove over to the apartment again. He knew the process was taking longer than expected, but he couldn't bear to face her with the news that the system was holding him back. How could he explain that the bureaucratic red tape might prevent him from keeping his promise? When he arrived, the woman was sitting outside, her daughters playing quietly on the small patch of grass beside their building. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but there was a hint of sadness behind her smile. "Hi," she greeted him, standing up as he approached. "I was just talking to my girls about how things are going. They're excited to meet you tomorrow. We're getting closer, right?" The millionaire hesitated. The girls, who had once been distant and cautious around him, were now beginning to warm up. They were starting to see him as a source of hope, as a potential father figure. But he knew he couldn't lie to them, not when they were beginning to trust him. "I wish I could say yes," he admitted, his voice heavy. "But there's been some delay. The paperwork, there's more red tape than I expected. The system doesn't move quickly." Her face fell. "More delays?" she whispered. I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up." He could hear the quiet desperation in her voice, and it stung. He had promised to make things better for them, to bring them the hope they so desperately needed, but it felt like the world was working against him. And now, he had to explain to her that they weren't any closer to their new life than they had been a month ago. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm doing everything I can. But it's taking longer than I expected. I know it's hard, but I need you to trust me. I'm not going anywhere. I'll help however I can. Just, please be patient a little longer." The woman sat down heavily on the small bench outside her apartment, her face a mask of exhaustion. "I've been patient my whole life," she said with a bitter laugh. "Patient through the homelessness, patient through the loss, through everything. I can't keep waiting forever." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they mirrored the quiet fear he had been trying to ignore. What if they never got through the system? What if he couldn't live up to the promise he had made? Her daughters approached, sensing the tension between them. The older one, her eyes bright and full of unspoken hope, glanced up at the millionaire. "Are we going to move into the house tomorrow?" she asked innocently, her words hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to bear. The millionaire swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Not tomorrow," he said softly, unable to meet her eyes. "But soon. I promise." He didn't know if he could keep that promise. He didn't know if the system would allow it. But in that moment, he knew one thing: he couldn't let them down. He couldn't break their trust, not now. That night, as he lay awake in his bed, the weight of the situation settled over him like a thick fog. He had thought that helping this family would be straightforward. He had thought that his resources would make a difference, that money could solve most problems. But he was learning that this wasn't about money. This was about more than that. It was about time, patience, and emotional commitment. He thought about the girls, their faces filled with hope, and the way the woman had looked at him, so vulnerable and yet so strong in her quiet determination. He couldn't let them fall through the cracks. Not now, not when they were depending on him. He sat up in bed, the silence of the night broken only by the hum of the city outside. And then, with a sense of clarity, he made a decision. He would take the next step, no matter what. He couldn't let bureaucracy stop him. He would hire the best lawyer, work with social services, and find a way to cut through the delays. He would make this happen. Not just for them, but for himself as well. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing their lives. It was about fixing something inside himself, about stepping out of the world of business deals and into the world of human connection. Wei, the younger one, had looked at him with quiet trust, as if he were the answer to all their struggles. The older girl, though more guarded, still held on to that fragile thread of hope, believing that this stranger could make their lives better. And the woman, her eyes, filled with gratitude and vulnerability, haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. He had promised to give them a better life. But right now, it felt as if that promise was slipping through his fingers. The system, bureaucracy, and the endless delays were more than he had bargained for. But it wasn't just the paperwork, it was the emotional complexity of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with an adoption process, he was dealing with real lives, real feelings, and a bond that was slowly being formed, despite the odds. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer for the system to catch up with his plans. He couldn't keep going back and forth with lawyers and social workers, hoping for the best. If he truly wanted to help them, he needed to take control. He contacted his lawyer first, outlining his plan to fast-track the adoption process through legal channels. It was going to cost him money, time, and energy, but he was ready to fight for this family. He wasn't going to let the red tape stand in the way of the future he had promised them. But even as he made the calls and sent the emails, a gnawing doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Was he prepared for what this would entail? Was he ready to change his entire life to become what these girls needed? What if he failed them? What if they grew to resent him? When he arrived at the apartment later that day, his resolve was stronger, but the weight of his decision still pressed heavily on his chest. The woman was sitting on the porch again, watching the girls play. Her face brightened when she saw him, but there was still a hesitancy in her eyes. "Any news?" she asked, hopeful but clearly trying to guard herself against disappointment. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was the right answer. "I'm pushing things through," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to make it happen, sooner rather than later. But it's going to take some time." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign that he might be lying. She had been let down before. She had seen promises broken too many times. But for some reason, she allowed herself to believe him. Perhaps it was the sincerity in his eyes, or perhaps it was because he hadn't backed down when things got difficult. "Thank you," she whispered, though there was a tremor in her voice. "I'm so scared. I don't want to get my hopes up." He understood. She had been let down by the world in ways that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He had no idea what it had been like for her, or the depth of the sacrifices she had made for her daughters. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't make empty promises. He couldn't let her down. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. "I won't give up on you." As the days passed, the tension between them slowly began to ease. The woman seemed to trust him more, and the girls, while still cautious, began to warm up to him. The older girl, in particular, seemed to be testing the boundaries, pushing him to see if he would truly be there for them. Every time she asked a question, he answered honestly. Every time she hesitated, he made sure she knew he wouldn't leave. But the real test was still ahead. The system was slow, and there were still obstacles that stood in their way. But as the millionaire spent more time with them, as he saw the struggles the woman had endured and the resilience in her daughters, something shifted inside him. This was no longer just about fulfilling a promise. It was about becoming part of their lives, truly understanding the sacrifices they had made, and realizing that this was not just about giving them a home, it was about being the stability they needed. That evening, as he left the apartment, the millionaire glanced back at the small, humble building. The weight of everything he had committed to settled on him once more, but this time, it felt different. The uncertainty was still there, but so was the understanding that he had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. He wasn't just helping them. He was becoming part of their journey. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know how this would end, or how long it would take to make it all work. But he was willing to fight for them. He was willing to do whatever it took. Weeks passed, and despite all the efforts, the adoption process seemed to move at a crawl. But something unexpected began to change during that time, something that neither the millionaire or the woman had anticipated. The initial days of uncertainty and doubt had slowly transformed into something more. The family had started to become a part of his life in ways he never imagined. His daily visits to their apartment became more than just a routine, they were moments of genuine connection. The girls, though still hesitant, began to see him not as a wealthy stranger offering temporary assistance but as a real person who cared about them. He had spent hours helping the older girl with her homework, something she had struggled with before, and listening to the younger one's shy stories about her imaginary friends. The woman had begun to trust him more as well, sharing bits of her life, her struggles, her past, the overwhelming weight of trying to raise her daughters in a world that hadn't been kind to them. But while these small moments brought them closer, they also made the millionaire realize just how unprepared he was for the depth of responsibility he was taking on. His life, once filled with luxury, deadlines, and board meetings, had now been replaced by something far more complicated, something real. It was during one of these visits that everything. The millionaire left the apartment that day with his heart heavy and his mind swirling with uncertainty. It wasn't just the threat of eviction that troubled him, it was the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He had promised these girls a better life, a future free of fear and hardship. But how could he deliver that when the very foundation of their lives was crumbling beneath them? The following days were a blur of meetings and phone calls as he scrambled to find a solution. He reached out to friends, colleagues, and legal teams, but the answer was always the same: there was no quick fix. The housing market was tight, and any available spaces were far beyond what they could afford. Even his own resources didn't seem to offer a straightforward way out. He had one more option left, one he had been avoiding. It was a bold move, a risky one. But if he truly wanted to follow through on his promise, he would have to take it. That evening, he stood outside a large, empty house on the outskirts of town. The house wasn't his. It wasn't even in his name yet. But he had decided that the only way forward was to give them a fresh start. To make a home for them, no matter the cost. As he walked through the front door, the future still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: the real journey was just beginning. No easy way out. The eviction was a reality that couldn't be ignored, and no matter how much money or influence he had, he couldn't bypass the system entirely. The landlord had given the notice, and the legal process was already underway. But the millionaire wasn't the type to back down in the face of a challenge. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just a paperwork issue anymore, it was personal. This was about doing the right thing, about protecting these girls and their mother from a life of uncertainty. That evening, he returned to the apartment, a plan forming in his mind. He had called in favors, pulled strings, and even set up meetings with housing experts. But the real turning point came when he spoke with a local non-profit organization that specialized in helping families facing eviction. They offered him a lifeline, a way to speed up the process and help them get into a temporary shelter while the adoption process continued. The woman was shocked when he told her the news. She hadn't expected help, especially not this soon. "But, this means we don't have to leave the city? You really found a way?" He nodded, his face softer now, a hint of relief in his eyes. We're not out of the woods yet, but it's a start. You and the girls can stay somewhere safe for now, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. The woman blinked back tears, her gratitude overwhelming. I don't know how to thank you. This means everything to us. As they sat in the small apartment, making plans for the immediate future, the millionaire found himself feeling something he hadn't expected, genuine relief. He wasn't just solving a problem, he was giving them a real chance at a new beginning. And for the first time in months, he could see the possibility of a future where they were safe, secure, and loved. But the biggest hurdle was still ahead of them, the adoption. The delays, the bureaucracy, the uncertainty of it all still loomed large. Even though he had secured temporary shelter, it was far from a permanent solution. That night, after leaving the apartment, the millionaire drove through the city streets, his thoughts a tangled mess. He could see how much the woman and her daughters needed him, and he could feel the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. But he also realized something else, that despite all the obstacles, he had already become part of their lives in ways he never expected. As he parked outside his own home, he glanced at his phone, his inbox filled with more updates about the adoption process. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But he was all in now. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about them. The next day, he took a step he hadn't anticipated. He contacted his legal team and instructed them to expedite everything they could. But he also did something else, something far more personal. He reached out to the woman and told her that he would be with her every step of the way. You're not alone in this, he said over the phone, his voice resolute. We're in this together. No matter what happens, I'll be here. For the first time since the adoption process began, he felt the heavy weight of his promise begin to shift from a burden to something else, a shared responsibility. They were no longer just strangers, bound together by circumstance. They had become a family in the making. The following weeks brought their share of ups and downs. There were more meetings, more paperwork, and countless hurdles to overcome. But with each passing day, the woman and her daughters grew more comfortable with the idea of their new life. And as the millionaire spent more time with them, he realized that the connection they had formed was not based on pity or charity, it was something deeper, something real. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the adoption papers were approved. The day he received the call, he felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it was tempered by the realization that the journey wasn't over yet. The true work was just beginning. But this was a victory. He called the woman to share the news, and when she picked up, he could hear the shakiness in her voice. It's done, he said, his heart beating faster. You and your daughters are officially part of my family. I'm not going anywhere. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then, through the quiet, the woman's voice broke. Thank you. Thank you so much. We can't believe it. This is really happening. The tears in her voice mirrored the ones he had heard when they first met, tears of relief, of disbelief, of hope finally returning. And in that moment, the millionaire realized something powerful. It wasn't the house or the money that had changed their lives. It wasn't even the adoption process that had given them a chance at a better future. It was the commitment, the willingness to fight for them, and the understanding that family is more than just blood, it's the people you choose to stand by, no matter the cost. Stand by, no matter the cost. That was the lesson he had learned. The true value of family wasn't about grand gestures or material gifts, it was about showing up, being present, and offering your unwavering support when it mattered most. It was about the bonds you forged through shared struggle, hope, and trust. In the days that followed, the millionaire's life continued to shift in ways he couldn't have predicted. The family's transition into their new life was anything but easy, there were emotional hurdles, adjustments to their new home, and challenges with integrating into a world that was unfamiliar to them. But the bond they had formed over the past months had given them the strength to face it all together. The woman, once afraid to believe in the promise of a better life, had started to see a future that wasn't filled with constant fear. She was finally able to breathe without the weight of eviction and uncertainty hanging over her head. And the girls, who had once been wary and distant, were now settling into a new sense of safety and belonging. The millionaire, too, began to change. His life, once defined by boardrooms and business deals, was now shaped by the laughter of two young girls, the quiet strength of their mother, and the everyday moments of family life. He no longer viewed his wealth as just a tool for personal comfort but as a means to make a real difference. But the most profound change wasn't in the material things, it was in his heart. He had gone from seeing this family as a project, something he could fix, to realizing that they had given him something invaluable in return, a sense of purpose, a deeper connection to life, and an understanding of what it truly meant to be part of something bigger than himself. The final moment of this journey came when they all sat together, watching the sunset from the small balcony of their new home. The girls, now full of laughter and joy, played with their new toys while the woman sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "It's hard to believe," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. "How far we've come. From the streets to this. I never imagined it." The millionaire smiled, watching the girls run around in the golden light of the evening. "Neither did I. But here we are." In that moment, he understood that he had given them a new beginning. But in the process, they had given him a new life as well, one filled with meaning, connection, and the kind of love that doesn't come from wealth or status but from the willingness to give of yourself without expecting anything in return. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the millionaire realized that life wasn't about achieving the next big thing or making the most money. It was about the people who touched your heart, the moments that made you pause and reflect, and the bonds that carried you through life's challenges. The family he had promised to help had become his own. The journey wasn't easy, and there were many obstacles along the way. But it was a journey worth taking. Because, in the end, family wasn't something you were born into, it was something you chose. And he had chosen them. Life lesson. The true meaning of family isn't found in the ties of blood or the wealth we accumulate, it's in the bonds we build with the people who matter most. Family is not about perfection, but about the courage to stand by each other, especially when the road is difficult. When we choose to support, love, and commit ourselves to others, we discover a deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment than we ever could through personal success alone.